when a man in ripped jeans and scuffed boots walked into one of the most expensive watch stores in Beverly Hills, the manager took one look at him and made a snap decision. It took him 4 seconds. 4 seconds to glance at the torn jeans. 4 seconds to look at the messy hair. 4 seconds to decide that this man did not belong in a store where a single watch cost more than most people made in a year. So he walked over, and he said 7 words that would go on to cost his store over $4 million. But here is the thing. The man in the ripped jeans did not get angry. He did not raise his voice. He did not pull out his wallet and prove anything to anyone. He simply smiled, said thank you, and turned toward the door. And that is the moment everything changed. Because standing at the back of the store was a 23-year-old girl on only her 3rd month at her very first real job. A girl whose grandfather had once spent 2 hours with this man in a tiny watch repair shop on Sunset Boulevard. A girl who recognized something in the way this man looked at the watches. Not the way someone looks at something they want to buy, but the way someone looks at something they deeply love. She had a choice. She could stay quiet, stay safe, keep her head down and let the manager handle it the way managers always handled it. Or she could say his name. She said his name. And what happened next set off a chain of events that would change her life, her mother's life, her sister's life, and her brother's life, in ways that none of them could have ever imagined. Standing in that Pasadena apartment, counting every dollar, trying to figure out how to close a $12,000 gap that stood between their youngest sister and the engineering degree she had dreamed about since she was 9 years old. But there is something else, something nobody knew at the time, something that had been happening quietly, invisibly, for 4 years before that Tuesday afternoon on Rodeo Drive. The man in the ripped jeans already knew this family. And the secret he had been keeping, the thing he had been doing in the dark, without telling anyone, without asking for a single word of thanks, is the part of this story that will stop you cold. Stay with us through every chapter of this story, because the ending is not what you think it is. And when it arrives, you will understand that the real story was never about the watches, never about the $4 million, and never about the manager's mistake. It was about a watchmaker named Carlos, who saw people clearly his whole life. And about what happens when the people he saw clearly never forgot it. The morning of March 14, 2023 arrived on Rodeo Drive the way it always does. Quietly, expensively, and without apology. By 10 o'clock, the palm trees lining the boulevard were already casting their long, thin shadows across the sidewalk. A man in a white valet uniform polished the brass handle of a boutique door 3 storefronts down. A woman in a camel coat walked a small dog that probably had its own publicist. A black Mercedes idled at the curb while its driver waited, engine running, going nowhere. This is a street that does not hurry. It has no reason to. Feldman and Holt Timepieces sits at the quieter northern end of the boulevard, between a French leather goods house and a jeweler whose window display changes only twice a year. The storefront is understated by Rodeo Drive standards. No flashing signage, no massive photographs of beautiful people. Just a brushed steel nameplate, 2 window displays lit from below like museum exhibits, and a single glass door so clean it barely seems to exist. The store was founded in 1987 by Gerald Feldman, a soft-spoken man from Basel, Switzerland, who had trained under 2 of the most respected watchmakers in Geneva, before deciding that Los Angeles needed a place where serious collectors could be taken seriously. He was right. Within 5 years, the client list included names that required a non-disclosure agreement just to speak aloud. Within 10, Gerald had sold timepieces to movie stars, 3 foreign heads of state, and a tech entrepreneur who purchased a single watch for $1.8 million and paid for it in cash, in a backpack, on a Tuesday. Gerald retired in 2021. The store passed to his daughter, who ran operations from New York, and hired Preston Caldwell to manage the Beverly Hills floor. Preston arrived in January 2023, 10 weeks before this particular Tuesday afternoon. He is 34 years old, with the kind of precise, assembled appearance that takes real effort to achieve, and even more effort to maintain. His suit jacket fits him exactly right across the shoulders. His watch, a steel Jaeger LeCoultre Reverso, sits exactly where a watch should sit on the wrist. He knows every timepiece in the store by caliber, case material, power reserve, and retail price to the cent. He can tell a genuine antique from a replica in under 20 seconds from across the room. He is, by every professional measure, exactly the right person for this job. He believes, deeply and sincerely, that presentation is everything, that the way something looks on the outside tells you almost everything you need to know about what is on the inside. He learned this in New York, where he spent 6 years managing the watch floor of one of the most prestigious department stores in the world, and where he was rewarded, repeatedly, for being right about it. He has been right about it so many times that he has stopped questioning it. That is the thing about a belief that keeps being confirmed. It starts to feel less like a belief and more like a law. At 2:14 p.m., the glass door opens. The man who walks in is tall. That is the first thing. Tall and unhurried, with the particular stillness of someone who has spent a long time becoming comfortable in their own body. His hair is dark, longer than is fashionable, slightly tangled at the ends in the specific way that suggests he has been outdoors rather than simply unbothered. His jeans are dark wash, worn at both knees, the right knee torn open in a wide diagonal tear that is not the decorative kind, not the manufactured distress you see on a rack at a boutique. The tear is real. The boots below them are black, scuffed at the toe, with one lace that has been re-knotted midway up where it once broke. He is not wearing sunglasses. He is not looking at his phone. There is no assistant at his shoulder, no publicist 3 steps behind, no security person holding a door. He is alone, completely, in the way that only people who are very comfortable or very famous or very much themselves can be alone in a place like this. He stops at the first display case. He looks down at the watches inside it, and his face changes. It changes the way a face changes, when it encounters something it genuinely loves. Not performance, not appraisal, not calculation. The specific softening that happens when recognition meets feeling. He looks at the watches the way you look at a view you have been waiting to see again for a long time. Preston looks up from the desk where he has been reviewing inventory reports. His eyes travel from the boots to the jeans, to the hair, to the torn knee, and complete their assessment in, by his own later count, approximately 4 seconds. He comes around the counter. He speaks first. "Good afternoon," he says. "Are you waiting for someone?" 4 words. Are you waiting for someone? Not, "Welcome to Feldman and Holt." Not, "How can I help you today?" Not even the neutral, uncommitted, "Can I help you?" Are you waiting for someone? The sentence that says, without saying, "You are not the customer. You cannot be the customer." A person who looks the way you look does not come here for themselves. You must be here for someone else. The man at the display case looks up. He has dark eyes and a patient expression and a face that, in different clothes, in a different context, surrounded by the right signals, Preston would almost certainly have recognized immediately. He doesn't. Not in this moment. Not yet. The man smiles. It is a small smile, and it is entirely genuine, and it does not contain a single molecule of anger. He says, "I'm looking for a gift. I have some time." His voice is quiet. He says it the way you say something when you mean exactly what you are saying and nothing else. No subtext, no challenge, no performance of patience. Just a man, looking for a gift, with some time. At the back of the store, a 23-year-old sales associate named Lena Park watches all of this from beside the vintage Rolex display. She is 3 months into her first real job after graduating from Cal State Los Angeles, with a degree in business administration and a minor in art history that her mother considered impractical and that she considered essential. She cannot yet afford to shop anywhere on this street. She takes 2 buses to get here in the morning. She watches the man at the display case, the way her late grandfather used to watch people who came into his own small shop on the east side of Los Angeles, with the particular attention of someone trying to understand what a person actually wants, rather than what they appear to want. Her grandfather repaired watches for 40 years. He always said the first thing you look for is not the watch but the hands. You can fake a suit. You cannot fake the hands of someone who has spent years working with fine mechanisms. She looks at the tall man's hands. They are still, deliberate. The hands of someone who knows how to handle small, precise, irreplaceable things. She takes a step forward. Preston raises his right hand. Barely, just slightly, a half-inch lift of the palm. "I have this." She stops. Preston tells the man that the store operates by appointment for serious inquiries, and that he would be very happy to get something scheduled later in the week. "There are slots available on Thursday," he says. "Friday morning is also open." The man in the ripped jeans listens to all of this. He nods once, the single, clean nod of someone who has heard what was actually said beneath what was said out loud. He thanks Preston. He says it like he means it. He turns toward the glass door. Lena Park has been standing at the back of the store for the 11 seconds this has taken. And in those 11 seconds, something has been building in her chest. A feeling she will later describe in an interview as being like watching someone drop something precious and not being close enough to catch it, but being close enough to see exactly when it left their hands. She opens her mouth. She says it loud enough for the whole store to hear. Loud enough for the man at the door to stop walking. Loud enough for Preston Caldwell to turn and look at her with an expression she has never seen on his face before. She says, "Mr. Reeves, please don't go." The store goes very quiet. Not the polite quiet of a place that is simply calm. A different kind of quiet. The kind that arrives when something has just shifted and everyone in the room knows it, but no one has yet decided what to do about it. The ambient music, something soft and classical that played from hidden speakers near the ceiling, seemed to lower itself out of courtesy. There were 2 other people in the store at that moment. A couple in their 60s, browsing the dress watches near the far wall, turned to look. The silver-haired man behind the secondary display counter, Marcus, the senior horologist who had worked at Feldman and Holt since Gerald himself was still on the floor, looked up from the movement he was examining under a loupe and set it carefully down on its cloth. Everyone turned toward Lena Park. Lena, who had spoken from the back of the store with a voice she had not entirely planned to use, was now standing very still and very straight. She was 23 years old. She had been in this job for 11 weeks. She had never completed a sale above $8,000. She had never directly contradicted her manager's handling of a customer. She had eaten her lunch in the back office every day for 3 months because she was still too nervous to eat at the small staff table near the stockroom where Preston sometimes sat. She had just said the name of one of the most recognizable actors on earth at full volume inside a store that prided itself on its discretion. She did not take it back. Preston turned first to Lena. His expression was the expression of a man watching a sum he had already calculated come out to the wrong number. It lasted for exactly 1 second. The second it took for him to also turn toward the door, toward the man who had stopped walking, toward the particular way the man was now standing, with his hand not quite on the door and his head slightly turned. And then it happened. The way it always happens with famous people when recognition is delayed and then arrives. Not gradually, not in pieces, but all at once. The whole face resolving into someone you know, someone you have watched move and speak and exist for years. So many years that the recognition carries the strange intimacy of memory even though you have never met. Preston saw it. He saw it the way you see something you cannot unsee. The man at the door was Keanu Reeves. He had directed him toward the exit. He had suggested he make an appointment. He had looked at the ripped jeans and the scuffed boots and the untangled hair and constructed, in 4 seconds, a conclusion that was now dissolving in real time, right here, in front of 2 retired clients from Pasadena and the senior horologist and a 23-year-old associate who had known before anyone else. The thing Preston Caldwell will say in an interview 18 months from now, the thing he will struggle to articulate for a long time before he finally finds the right words, is that the worst part was not the embarrassment. The worst part was the specific quality of Keanu Reeves' face in the moment he turned back from the door. Because it was not cold, it was not offended. It did not carry the charged, contracted look of a famous person who has been disrespected and intends to establish that fact. It was kind, open, patient. The face of a man who is not surprised by this particular experience and has long since decided what to do with it when it happens, which is to not make it worse for the person it is happening to. He turned from the door and looked at Lena first. He said, quietly, "You didn't have to do that." Lena held her ground. She said, "I know. But my dad is a huge fan." She paused. The next sentence was one she had not planned to say. It came from somewhere that planning does not reach. She said, "And I recognized you because my grandfather had a photograph of the 2 of you together. He repaired a watch for you once, in 2017. His name was Carlos Reyes." The store, which was already quiet, became quieter, because Keanu Reeves went very still. Not the polite stillness of someone receiving unexpected information. The different stillness. The stillness of someone for whom a door has just opened in a wall they thought was solid. He said the name, Carlos. He said it softly. He said it the way you say a name that belongs to a memory you have kept carefully and intact. Not because it is dramatic, but because it matters. Because it is one of those small, specific human encounters that a person carries forward without quite knowing why, until a moment like this one makes the reason clear. "Carlos Reyes," he said again. Not a question, a recognition. "He was one of the finest craftsmen I ever met," Keanu said. He was looking at Lena now, with the full weight of his attention, which, as anyone who has been on the receiving end of it will tell you, is a substantial thing. "We talked for 2 hours. He showed me the inside of my Submariner, like it was a living thing." He paused. "He told me his daughter wanted to be an engineer." Lena's eyes filled with tears. She had not expected to cry. She was her father's daughter, and her father never cried in the shop. Not once in 22 years, not even on the days when the work broke his back, and the money barely covered the rent. She blinked hard. "That's Rosa," she said. "She's my sister." And here is the thing about that sentence. The thing that makes this moment more than a story about a celebrity and a store on a famous street. Rosa was 19 years old and sitting at home that afternoon in a Pasadena apartment, studying calculus for a degree she was not sure she could afford to complete, carrying a dream that her father had believed in with his whole quiet heart. She had no idea this conversation was happening. She had no idea that her name had just been spoken inside a bulletproof glass showroom on Rodeo Drive, by her sister, to a man who had once sat with their father for 2 hours and listened to him talk about the inside of a watch as though it contained the whole world. Preston Caldwell had not moved. He was standing in the same position he had been standing when Lena said the name, 4 feet from the secondary counter, one hand resting on its glass surface. He would later say he felt rooted there, that his legs did not seem to receive the instruction to move, that he was watching all of this with the specific, awful clarity of a person who has made a precise error and can see every degree of it from where he is standing. He did not speak. There was nothing to say that would not make it worse. So he listened. Keanu Reeves looked at Lena Park for a long moment. Then he looked, briefly and without hostility, at Preston. Then he looked back at Lena. He said, "Tell me about your family." And then he did something that no one in the store had expected. He walked back in, not toward the watches, not toward the display cases, not toward anything in the store that had a price tag attached to it. He walked toward the long wooden bench near the entrance that Gerald Feldman had installed in 1991 for clients who were waiting, or thinking, or simply needed somewhere to sit. He sat down. He looked at Lena, and he waited for her to begin. Preston Caldwell, still rooted to his spot 4 feet away, made a decision in that moment. It was smaller than the decision he had made 20 minutes ago when the man first walked through the door. But it would cost him something different. Not money, not prestige, but the comfortable certainty that his 4-second rule had ever been as reliable as he believed. He decided to listen too. Lena Park had not planned to speak for 40 minutes. She had not planned to speak at all, beyond the name she had called across the store. The name that had stopped a man at a door and changed the temperature of an entire room in under 3 seconds. She had planned, if anything, to step back and let whatever happened next happen without her in the middle of it. But Keanu Reeves had sat down on the bench and looked at her with the particular quality of attention that she would spend a long time afterward trying to describe accurately to people who asked. It was not the attention of someone being polite. It was not the careful, managed listening of a famous person who has learned to perform interest as a social skill. It was something older and simpler than that. It was the attention of someone who actually wanted to know, so she talked. She started with her father, because her father was where the story started. And she had learned from Carlos Reyes himself that every story has a real beginning, and you dishonor it when you start somewhere easier. She told Keanu that Carlos had worked in watch repair for 22 years, that he had never owned his own shop, but had always intended to, that he had worked for 3 different repair houses in Los Angeles over those 22 years, the last being a small but respected workshop on Sunset Boulevard called Precision & Son, where he had been the senior technician from 2012 until the week he died. That he had treated every watch that came across his bench, whether it was a $180 Seiko or a $180,000 Vacheron, with the same focused, unhurried care, because he believed, and said often, that a mechanism does not know what it cost. It only knows whether it has been understood. Keanu listened to all of this without interrupting. He was leaning forward slightly on the bench, elbows on his knees, hands loosely joined. He was not looking at his phone. He was not scanning the room. There was no performance of patience in his body, none of the small signals that people give when they are waiting for their turn to speak. He was simply present, completely, in the specific and rare way that made Lena feel as though this conversation was the only thing happening in the world at this moment, which, for her, it was. She told him about Dorothy. She described her mother in the careful way that children describe parents they are proud of and worried about at the same time, with love running just beneath the surface of every practical detail. Dorothy Reyes, 58 years old, night shift at Huntington Hospital in Pasadena. 11 years on the same floor, the same corridor, the same 3 a.m. quiet of a building, where people were either healing or not. Her knees had been bad for 2 years. She had been told by her doctor to consider a different job. She had smiled at her doctor and said she would think about it, and then gone back the next night, because the family needed the income, and Dorothy Reyes did not put things down before they were finished. Keanu's expression did not change in the performative way. No theatrical sympathy, no widened eyes. But something in his face settled. The way a face settles when it is receiving information it recognizes. He asked, "What ward does she work on?" Lena said, "The recovery ward. Mostly. She says she likes it because the people there are already past the worst part." He nodded once. He said nothing. He filed it. She told him about Marco. Marco was 26, the eldest, the one who had inherited Carlos's hands if not his specific trade. He could rebuild a 1975 Honda CB750 from raw components, in a garage with 4 tools and a work light. He understood engines the way Carlos had understood movements, intuitively, structurally, with the kind of knowledge that lives in the fingers as much as the mind. He had been working out of a rented garage space in East Los Angeles for 3 years, restoring vintage Japanese and British motorcycles from the 1960s and 1970s, doing extraordinary work for a small and devoted clientele who found him entirely by word of mouth, because Marco could not afford the business license that would allow him to advertise. And advertising without a license was a risk he refused to take because the garage was rented and the landlord was already looking for reasons. He wanted his own shop. He had wanted it since he was 17. He had a name picked out. He had a sign designed, sketched on graph paper, taped to the wall above his workbench. He did not have the money to make it real. Keanu asked what kind of British bikes Marco preferred. Lena said, Triumph and BSA mostly. He found a 1968 Bonneville last year. He said it was like finding a letter someone forgot to send. Keanu smiled at that. It was a different smile from the one at the door, smaller, more private. The smile of someone hearing a sentence that lands exactly right. Then Lena told him about Rosa. This part was the hardest, and she had not expected it to be. Rosa was 19, and brilliant in the specific, quietly burning way of people who have been told repeatedly that their dreams are impractical, and have decided to treat that information as a challenge rather than a verdict. She had been accepted to UCLA's Samueli School of Engineering, mechanical engineering, with an intended focus on aerospace systems, because Rosa had decided at age 14, after watching a documentary about the Mars rover, that if machines were going to go to space, someone needed to understand exactly how they worked, and that someone could be her. She had deferred enrollment. The financial aid package had left a gap of $12,000. The family had $47,000 saved between them, set aside over years of double shifts and careful spending, and the particular discipline of people who know that money does not accumulate by accident. But the $12,000 gap sat on top of the first year's remaining costs and would not move, and Rosa had looked at the numbers and told her mother quietly, on a Sunday evening in August, that she would wait a year, that she would work, that she would close the gap herself. Dorothy had said nothing. She had gone into her bedroom and closed the door and been very quiet for a long time. Lena stopped talking. The store was still around them. Marcus, the senior horologist, had gone back to his work, or appeared to. The couple near the far wall had quietly left. Preston Caldwell was standing with his back to the secondary counter now, arms crossed loosely, looking at the floor in front of him, with the expression of a man reading something written there that he does not entirely like. Keanu was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father told me about Rosa. In 2017, he said she took apart a wall clock at age 9 to see how the escapement worked and put it back together correctly." He paused. He was very proud when he said it. It was the kind of proud that doesn't need to perform itself. Lena pressed her lips together hard. Keanu looked at her steadily. He said, "Thank you for telling me all of that. You didn't have to." She said, "My father would have. He talked to everyone." Keanu said, "I remember." He stood up from the bench. He straightened his jacket, the same faded one, the same worn collar. He looked across the store at the display cases with their lit contents and their bulletproof glass and their carefully maintained silence. He said, "Okay, now show me your best 2 watches." Lena Park, 3 months into her first real job, 23 years old, with her father's patience and her mother's spine, and her sister's determination living somewhere in her chest all at once, straightened her jacket and walked him to the case. Behind her, Preston Caldwell uncrossed his arms. He was still listening. He had heard every word. And the thing he was hearing beneath all of it, beneath the story of a family, beneath the name of a dead watchmaker, beneath the $12,000 gap that sat between a 19-year-old girl and the rest of her life, was the sound of his own 4-second rule coming apart at its seams. He had memorized every watch in this store. He had not, until today, considered how much else there was to memorize. Lena walked Keanu Reeves to the first case slowly. Not because she was nervous, though she was, underneath everything, in the specific way of someone performing an important task for the first time, while fully aware of its importance. She walked slowly, because she had learned this from watching Marcus, the senior horologist, in her 3 months on the floor. Marcus never rushed toward a case. He said once, in passing, that the approach told the customer how to feel about what they were about to see. Rush, and you imply the watch needs selling. Move with intention, and you imply the watch has been waiting. She moved with intention. She stopped at the second case from the left, not the first, which held the most visually dramatic pieces, the ones designed to stop people at the window, the ones that shouted. She stopped at the second case, which held the pieces that rewarded knowledge, the ones that a person with genuine fluency would find, and a person without it would walk past. She unlocked the case with the small steel key that lived in her jacket pocket and lifted the hinged glass with both hands. Keanu leaned forward. He looked at the tray for a long time without touching anything. This was the first sign, the sign that Marcus would later say when Lena told him the story over coffee 3 days afterward, confirmed everything she had already understood in the moment the man first looked at the window display. People who do not know watches touch them quickly, to confirm they are real, to possess them momentarily with their hands. People who know watches look first. They read the dial, the case, the proportions, the way the light moves across the finish. They take time with the looking because they understand that the looking is not preliminary to the experience. It is the experience. Keanu looked for 30 seconds. Then he pointed. He said, "The Aquanaut. The Patek Philippe Aquanaut 5968A. Stainless steel case, 42.2 millimeters. Black composite strap. The dial a deep charcoal with an embossed texture that caught the case lighting and turned it into something almost geological, like looking at the surface of something very old. Retail price, $68,000. By the standards of Feldman and Holt, it was not the most expensive watch in the case. It was not even the second most expensive. There were 3 pieces in that tray alone that commanded higher prices, including an astonishing yellow gold Patek annual calendar at $112,000, that sat 2 positions to the right, and that most visitors, regardless of their knowledge, gravitated toward immediately because yellow gold commands attention. Keanu had not looked at the yellow gold. He had looked at the 5968A. Lena lifted it from the tray carefully and set it on the viewing cloth, a small square of dark navy that Gerald Feldman had specified in the store's original operating manual because he believed that watches should be seen against something dark and calm. She set it down and stepped back. Keanu picked it up. He turned it over. He examined the case back. Solid, non-exhibition, the Patek Philippe seal engraved cleanly into the steel. He turned it face up again. He held it at the particular angle that takes the glare off the crystal. He said, without looking up, "The 5968A is the one people overlook." Lena said, "My grandfather said the same thing about the people he respected most." Keanu looked up at her then. He said nothing, but he set the watch down on the cloth with the particular care of a decision being made. He said, "This one, and show me the FP Journe." The FP Journe Chronometre Blue lived in the 3rd case, in a locked inner tray, behind the primary display row. It was not shown casually. François-Paul Journe made fewer than 900 watches per year across his entire collection. a number so small in the context of the industry that it bordered on philosophical statement. The chronomètre bleu was among the most coveted of those 900. Its movement was built entirely in-house, its blue dial achieved through a process that Jern had refined over years to produce a particular depth of color that changed in different lights. Blue in the shade, closer to gray in direct sun, something between the two in the warm case lighting of Feldman and Holt. Retail price, $312,000. Lena retrieved it without hesitation. She set it beside the aquanaut on the navy cloth. She stepped back again and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment required. Keanu looked at both watches together for a long moment. He said, "The journey is for the auction. The aquanaut is for me." He paused. The FP Jern consistently exceeds retail at charity auction, especially in Los Angeles. I've seen it happen 4 times. He was not performing knowledge. He was simply stating a logistical fact in the same tone he might use to describe a road he had driven before. He had done research. He had thought about this purchase before he walked through the door. He had come here with a plan and a purpose and a budget and the considered opinion of someone who had spent years learning to love what he was looking at. Preston Caldwell, standing 6 feet behind and to the left, heard all of this. He heard the selection. He heard the reasoning. He heard the specific, practiced intelligence of a man who had walked into the store looking like he had no business being there, and had then demonstrated, in the space of 10 quiet minutes, that he understood the inventory better than most people who visited in hand-stitched suits with appointments and assistants. Total purchase, $380,000. Lena's hands were steady when she processed the transaction. She had decided they would be. She took the card, a black one, the kind that does not advertise its own exclusivity because it does not need to, and completed the sale with the same careful, unhurried movements she used for every transaction, because the amount on the receipt did not change what the watches were or what they deserved. When the receipt printed, Keanu signed it and handed back the pen. Then he turned to Preston. He did not move toward him. He simply turned, the way you turn toward someone when you have something to say and you want them to hear it clearly. He said, "What do you think that young woman's commission will be on this sale?" Preston did not hesitate. He was beyond hesitation now, past the place where pride or defensiveness had any useful function. He did the arithmetic in his head. Standard commission at Feldman and Holt for a sale of this magnitude sat at 3%. On $380,000. That was $11,400. He said the number out loud. Keanu nodded slowly. He said, "Make it 23,000. Preston opened his mouth. Keanu continued before the breath could become an objection. "Take the difference from my end. Mark it as a consulting fee. I don't care how you file it internally." He looked at Preston with the same steady, non-hostile directness he had used throughout the afternoon. She earned it twice, once for knowing her watches, once for saying my name when it would have been easier not to. Preston said, "Yes, just that. One word. The easiest and most difficult word he had said all afternoon." Keanu picked up the black bag that Lena had prepared. Tissue-wrapped boxes, authentication cards, the Feldman and Holt certificate in its cream envelope, and held it at his side. He looked at Lena one final time. He said, "You did well today." Lena said, "My father taught me to look at the hands." Keanu smiled. He said, "Carlos always paid attention to what mattered." He turned and walked toward the glass door. He pushed it open. The afternoon light on Rodeo Drive caught him for a moment in the doorway. The ripped jeans, the scuffed boots, the worn jacket, the bag from one of the most exclusive watch boutiques in North America hanging from one hand. And then he was gone. Back into the quiet boulevard. Back into the ordinary afternoon. Back into the specific invisibility of a person who has never needed anyone to know who he was in order to know exactly what he was doing. Lena stood at the counter. Her hands were gripping its edge. She was not shaking. She was her father's daughter. but her knuckles were white. Behind her, Preston Caldwell moved for the first time in what felt like a very long while. He walked to the display case that Lena had left open and began, slowly, to close it. He lowered the glass. He turned the key. He stood there for a moment, with his hand resting on the top of the case, looking at the navy cloth where 2 watches had sat 20 minutes ago. One for a man who knew what he loved, and one for children who needed someone in their corner. He had memorized every watch in this store. He had not, until today, considered how much else there was to memorize. He straightened up. He walked to his desk. He opened his email. He typed Lena Park's name into the subject line, and he began, slowly and carefully, to write something he should have written a long time ago about someone he had almost allowed to walk out the door without ever being seen. The email Preston wrote took him 40 minutes. He deleted it twice before he found the right words, which surprised him because he was a man accustomed to finding the right words quickly. In New York, he had written performance reviews, client correspondence, inventory proposals, and staff announcements with the efficient, polished speed of someone who had learned that in luxury retail, language was another form of presentation. Clean sentences, confident assertions, nothing left ragged at the edge. This email was different. This email had to be honest. And honesty, he was discovering, required more drafts than confidence did. He wrote it a third time and sent it before he could delete it again. The subject line read, Lena Park, Commission Adjustment and Commendation. The body was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph documented the commission adjustment, $23,000. The additional $11,600 to be drawn from the discretionary client relations budget that Gerald Feldman had established for exceptional circumstances. Because Preston had decided, after sitting with it for 40 minutes, that this qualified as an exceptional circumstance in every possible interpretation of those 2 words. The second paragraph described, in plain language, what Lena had done that afternoon, and why it reflected the values that Feldman and Holt had been built on. He used the word integrity once. He did not use it again because he felt once was enough, and twice would have felt like he was trying to convince himself. The third paragraph was the shortest. It said, I made an error in judgment today that you corrected. The store is better for what you did. I want that on record. He read it back once. Then he forwarded it to the store owner in New York with a brief note of explanation. Then he closed his laptop and sat in the quiet of the store after closing, alone with the locked cases and the Italian carpet and the silver trays, for a long time. 2 nights later, Dorothy Reyes was 40 minutes into her shift at Huntington Hospital. It was 3:17 in the morning, and the recovery ward was in the particular state it reached at this hour. Not silent, because hospitals are never fully silent, but settled. The ventilators kept their rhythms. The monitors held their steady tones. The corridor lights ran low and amber, the night mode setting that was easier on recovering eyes, and on the eyes of the people who moved through the building, while the rest of the world was somewhere else entirely. Dorothy had her mop and her cart, and the specific, practiced efficiency of a woman who had done this for 11 years and knew every square foot of this floor, the way a musician knows a piece they have played 10,000 times. Not consciously, not with effort, but with the body. Her knees ached in the right one worse than the left, the way they always did by the 3rd hour of the shift. She had a small piece of tape on the inside of her left shoe where a seam had started rubbing. She had a photograph in her locker of a Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime that she had cut from a magazine 4 years ago, and kept, not because she wanted the watch, but because Carlos had once repaired one. Not that exact reference, but a cousin of it, and had come home that evening and described the movement to her over dinner with the reverent, particular joy of a man who had been allowed to hold something extraordinary. She kept the photograph because it kept his voice close. Her phone buzzed at 3:17 a.m. She pulled it from her scrubs pocket and looked at the screen. Lena's name. Lena never called during the night shift. Lena knew the shift schedule the way all of the Reyes children knew it. Not as a fact, but as a physical reality of their lives. The shape that their mother's absence made in the nighttime hours. The gap at the kitchen table. The unlocked door left for whenever she came home in the early gray morning. If Lena was calling at 3:17 a.m., something was wrong. Or something was very different from wrong. Dorothy stepped off the main corridor and pushed through the door of the supply closet at the end of the hall. She leaned her mop handle against the shelf of folded clean sheets. She answered. She said, "Lena, what happened?" Not a question. A mother's sentence. Statement shaped like a question, because a mother already knows the answer is going to require her full attention, and she is already giving it. Lena said, "Nothing bad, Mama. Nothing bad. Are you somewhere you can talk?" Dorothy looked at the shelf of sheets. She looked at the mop. She said, "I'm in the supply closet on 3. I have a few minutes." What followed lasted 11 minutes, and Dorothy would later say she could have told you the length of it to the second, because she lived every one of them with complete and specific awareness. The way you live moments that you understand, while they are happening, that you will carry for the rest of your life. Lena told her everything. She told it in order, the way Carlos had always told stories, beginning to end, no jumping ahead, because he said a story that skips its own middle is a watch with a missing gear. She told her about the man who walked through the door. She told her about the ripped jeans and the scuffed boots, and the 4 words that Preston had said. She told her about the name she had called across the store, and the silence that followed it, and the way Keanu Reeves had turned from the door with a face that was not angry. She told her about the bench, the 40 minutes, the questions he had asked. She told her about Marco, and how his name had made Keanu ask a follow-up question that Lena had nearly forgotten to mention. She told her about Rosa, about how she had said the $12,000 gap out loud in a watch store on Rodeo Drive to a man she had recognized from a photograph in her grandfather's things, and how he had listened to all of it the way Carlos used to listen, with his whole self, not just the surface of himself. She told her about the watches, the Aquanaut and the Journe, $380,000, the commission, $23,000, her name in an email with the word integrity in it. Dorothy listened to all of this without speaking. This was not unusual. Dorothy Reyes processed things inward first. Carlos used to say she was like a watch herself. All the important work happened inside, and you only saw the results on the face. Then Lena told her the last part, the part she had been saving. She told her about the note card. After Keanu had picked up his bag and turned for the door, he had stopped. He had asked for a pen and one of the store's monogrammed note cards from the front desk. He had written something down, not quickly, not casually, but with the deliberateness of a man who understood that what he was writing mattered and wanted the writing to reflect that. He had handed the card to Lena and said, "This is my assistant's direct number. Have Rosa call by Thursday. I know someone on the aerospace engineering faculty at UCLA. Not to promise anything, I don't do that. But Carlos deserved someone in his corner, and since he can't be here, I'd like to try." Lena read this to her mother at 3:17 in the morning, in a supply closet in Pasadena, the mop handle resting against the shelf beside her, the amber corridor light visible under the gap at the bottom of the door. There was a long silence. Dorothy Reyes, who had mopped this floor for 11 years, who had taped a photograph to the inside of her locker, who had worked the night shift through 2 of her children's graduations and 1 of her own birthdays, and the first 3 Christmases after her husband died because the shifts paid extra and the family needed extra, who had never in 11 years left her mop in the middle of a corridor. Dorothy Reyes slid down the wall of the supply closet until she was sitting on the floor. Her back was against the shelf of clean folded sheets. Her mop handle rested against the door. Her phone was pressed against her ear so hard she could feel the edge of the case. She did not cry. She was Dorothy Reyes, and she did not cry easily, and she did not cry now. But she sat on that floor for the full length of a breath that seemed to go on much longer than a breath has any right to last. Then she brought the phone back to her ear. Her voice, when it came, was changed. Not broken, changed. The way a key changes when it finally finds the lock it was made for, and turns. She said, "Your father talked about that man for weeks after he fixed the watch. He said, 'That one is different, mija. That one actually sees people.'" She paused. The ventilator kept its rhythm down the hall. The monitor held its tone. The amber light lay quiet under the door. Dorothy said, "He was right." Then she did something that no one who knew her would have been surprised by, because she was who she was, and she had always been who she was. She stood up. She picked up the mop. She opened the supply closet door and walked back out into the amber corridor and finished her shift. She had 4 hours left. She worked every single one of them. But something had shifted in the quality of the silence around her as she moved through the ward. Something lighter and less carried, like a coat taken off in a warm room after a long time outside. She moved through the rest of the night with the particular steadiness of a woman who has just received confirmation of something she already believed but had not been sure she was still allowed to believe. That good things found good people. That Carlos had been right about the man with the watch. That her daughter was going to make the call on Thursday. At 6:45 in the morning, when her shift ended, and the day staff arrived and the ward began its slow, brightening transition from night mode to daylight, Dorothy Reyes went to her locker. She opened it. She looked at the photograph of the Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime taped to the inside of the door. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she took it down carefully, folded it once along its center, and placed it in the pocket of her scrubs. Not thrown away, not left behind, just moved closer. The way you move something when it has changed from a reminder into something you want to keep near you for a different reason entirely. She closed the locker. She put on her coat. She walked out into the Pasadena morning, which was pale and cool and just beginning to turn gold at the edges. And she took the bus home the way she always did. And she sat in the third seat from the front the way she always did. And she looked out the window at the city waking up around her. She was thinking about Rosa. She was thinking about Thursday. She was thinking about Carlos, who had spent 2 hours with a man in a watch shop in 2017 and had come home that evening and said, over dinner, with the quiet certainty of a man who trusted his own judgment about people, "That one is different. That one actually sees." Dorothy looked out the bus window at the pale gold morning. She thought, yes, Carlos. He does. Rosa Reyes woke up on Thursday morning at 6:48 a.m. before her alarm. This was not unusual. Rosa had been waking before her alarm since she was 14 years old, when she had read a biography of aerospace engineer Judith Resnick, and decided that people who intended to do important things did not wait to be told to begin. She had set alarms since then out of habit and courtesy to the alarm itself, but she had not needed one in 5 years. She lay on her back in the room she shared with Lena and looked at the ceiling for 3 minutes. This was her thinking time. Carlos had done the same thing. Dorothy had told her once that her father lay still for exactly the first few minutes of every morning, not sleeping, not fully awake, just residing in the quiet space between the two where, he said, the clearest thoughts lived. Rosa had inherited this without being taught it. It was simply something her body knew. She thought about the call. Lena had given her the note card 2 nights ago, sitting at the kitchen table after Dorothy had gone to sleep. She had placed it face down first, the way you place something that needs a moment of preparation before it is seen, and then she had turned it over and slid it across the table. Rosa had read it twice. Then she had read it a 3rd time, slowly, the way she read engineering problems, not for the surface information, but for what the structure of it revealed. "This is my assistant's direct number. Have Rosa call by Thursday." She had set the card down. She had looked at Lena. She had said, very quietly, "He remembered what Dad said about me." Lena had said, "He remembered everything Dad said." Rosa had picked the card back up and taken it to her room and placed it on the desk beside her calculus textbook and her notebook and the mechanical pencil she used for problem sets, because she did not like to erase with anything that left a smear. She had looked at it before she slept. She had looked at it when she woke on Wednesday. She had carried the number in her mind all through Wednesday like a stone in a pocket. Present, weighted, real. Now it was Thursday. She got up. She made her bed with the specific, squared precision that she applied to physical tasks. Corners tight, pillow centered, because she believed, in the practical way her father had believed things, that the quality of attention you brought to small tasks was the same quality of attention you brought to large ones, and you could not switch it on selectively. It was either a habit or it wasn't. She showered. She dressed in dark jeans and a clean white shirt, which was what she wore when something mattered, the same way some people wore armor. She made coffee. Dorothy was asleep. The night shift had ended at 7, and she would sleep until mid-afternoon. Lena had a morning shift at the store. The apartment was quiet. In the particular way it was quiet when Rosa was the only one awake in it, which was a quietness she knew well and had always found useful rather than lonely. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and her notebook and the note card. She had written 3 things in the notebook the night before. 3 things she wanted to say if she froze, if the phone weight became too heavy, if the fact of who had written this number on this card in this store became suddenly too large to hold and speak through simultaneously. The 3 things were: my name is Rosa Reyes. My father was Carlos Reyes, a watchmaker. I want to study aerospace engineering. That was all. Just the facts of herself. Just the true, load-bearing structure of who she was and why she was calling. Everything else could follow from there, if the ground held. She looked at the note card. She looked at the number. She picked up her phone. She dialed. It rang twice. The sound of each ring was very loud in the quiet kitchen. Between the first and the second, she became aware of her own heartbeat in a way she normally was not, which she noted with the detached, observational part of her mind that was always running slightly separate from the rest of her, cataloging, recording, finding the data inside the experience. The second ring ended. A woman answered. Her voice was warm and professional in the specific way of someone who was good at her job because she genuinely liked it, rather than because she had learned to perform liking it. She said, "Good morning, this is Diane." Rosa opened her notebook. She looked at the 3 sentences. She took one breath and said, "Good morning. My name is Rosa Reyes. My father was Carlos Reyes, a watchmaker. I want to study aerospace engineering." There was a beat of silence. Then Diane said, "Rosa, I've been hoping you'd call." She said it warmly, but without theater, without the exaggerated brightness that would have made Rosa feel like a charity case rather than a person. She said it the way you say something to someone you were genuinely expecting and are genuinely glad to hear from. Mr. Reeves mentioned you specifically. He said you took apart a clock at age 9. Rosa said, "A wall clock, a Seth Thomas pendulum movement from 1962. I put it back together in 2 hours and 14 minutes. Diane said, "He said you got it running again." Rosa said, "It kept better time afterward than it did before." There was another beat. Then Diane said, and Rosa could hear the smile in it, "He said you might say something like that." What followed was not a long conversation. It was precise and purposeful, which was the kind of conversation Rosa respected most. Diane told her that Keanu had spoken with Professor James Nakamura at UCLA's Samueli School of Engineering. That Professor Nakamura had agreed to a 30-minute call with Rosa the following Tuesday at 2 p.m. That this was not a guarantee of anything. Diane said this clearly, and Rosa appreciated the clarity, because vague kindness was harder to plan around than honest information. But that Professor Nakamura was a man who took these conversations seriously when they were referred to him by someone he trusted, and that Rosa should prepare accordingly. Rosa wrote down every word. Professor James Nakamura, Samueli School of Engineering, UCLA, Tuesday, 2 p.m. She thanked Diane. She said it simply and meant it completely. Diane said, "Your father repaired a watch for someone who has never forgotten him. That matters." Rosa said, "I know. He was like that. People remembered him." She ended the call. She set the phone on the table. She sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen, with her notebook open and her coffee going cold, and the note card lying beside the 3 sentences she had written the night before. She pulled the notebook toward her and turned to a fresh page. She opened her laptop. She found Professor James Nakamura's faculty page at UCLA's Samueli School of Engineering. She read it with the complete, absorbing attention she brought to things that mattered. Not skimming, not scanning, but reading the way her father had examined a movement, thoroughly and in order, understanding the whole before forming any opinion of the parts. Professor James Nakamura. Research focus: advanced propulsion systems and lightweight composite structures for aerospace applications. Published 14 times in the Journal of Spacecraft and Rockets. Consulting work with NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, located in Pasadena, California. 12 minutes from this kitchen table. Rosa closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. This was something else she did. Not prayer, not exactly, but a deliberate acknowledgement of a moment before she moved through it into action. Carlos had done it too. She had watched him do it hundreds of times at his bench, before he picked up a tool, before he opened a caseback, before he began any work that required him to be fully present. She opened her eyes. She picked up her mechanical pencil. At the top of the fresh page, she wrote, "Professor James Nakamura, Tuesday 2 p.m. Prepare." Below it, she began to write. She wrote for 3 hours without stopping. Everything she knew about propulsion systems, composite structures, current research in lightweight aerospace materials, the JPL projects she had followed online since she was 16, the questions she had been accumulating for years without anyone specific to ask them to, the ideas that lived in the back of her mind, in the space where other people kept casual thoughts and Rosa kept engineering problems she had not yet solved. She filled 11 pages. At the bottom of the 11th page, without planning to, she wrote one sentence that was not about engineering at all. She wrote it in the smaller handwriting she used when something was private, when it was meant for the notebook and not for anyone else. She wrote, "Dad would have liked this." She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the notebook. She picked up her coffee, which was fully cold now, and which she drank anyway because she did not believe in wasting things, and she went back to her desk and opened her aerospace engineering coursework and began to study with the focused, unhurried intensity of someone who has 6 days to become the most prepared 19-year-old that Professor James Nakamura had ever spoken with. She intended to be exactly that. She studied for 9 hours. She took one break, at noon, to eat the lunch she had packed for herself the night before. Rice and black beans with the hot sauce her mother bought in the large bottle from the Mexican grocery on Lake Avenue because Carlos had liked it, and now they all liked it because it tasted like him. She ate at the kitchen table. She looked at the note card. She looked at the 3 sentences in the notebook. Then she packed up her lunch and went back to the desk and studied for 4 more hours. Outside the window, Pasadena moved through its ordinary Thursday afternoon. The freeway kept its distant sound. The neighbor's bougainvillea threw its purple shadow across the wall. The afternoon light shifted from gold to amber to the particular flat gray that came just before the streetlights came on. Rosa Reyes did not look up. She was working. The way her father had worked. The way her mother worked. The way her family had always worked. Not for applause, not for recognition, not because anyone was watching, but because the work itself was the point, and the work deserved everything you had. At 7:43 p.m., she closed her textbook, capped her pencil, and straightened her notebook on the desk. She was as ready as one day of preparation could make her. Tuesday was 6 days away. She would be more ready by then. Preston Caldwell did not tell anyone what happened on Rodeo Drive. Not his friends in New York, who sent him a group message on Saturday asking how the Beverly Hills life was treating him, and to whom he replied with a photograph of the view from his apartment window and a single thumbs-up emoji, because it was easier than the truth. Not his mother in Connecticut, who called on Sunday as she always did, and to whom he said work was going well, the store was performing, the clientele was exceptional, all of which was technically accurate, and none of which was what was actually on his mind. Not the regional director in New York, who sent a monthly check-in email asking for a brief narrative summary of notable client interactions, and to whom Preston wrote 3 careful paragraphs about a Saudi collector who had purchased a vintage Audemars Piguet, and a tech founder from Malibu who had come in with a list of references and left with a single piece he had not been on the list, and which cost more than everything on it combined. He did not mention Tuesday. He did not mention the man in the ripped jeans. He did not mention the 4 seconds. He did not mention them because he was not yet sure what to say about them. And Preston Caldwell had a deep and long-standing aversion to speaking about things he had not yet fully understood. This was, in most areas of his life, a useful quality. It made him precise. It made him careful. It made him the kind of manager who did not send emails in anger or make staffing decisions in haste. In this particular case, it meant he was alone with Tuesday for a long time. He replayed it constantly. Not in the dramatic, cinematic way that people describe replaying their worst moments. Not with music beneath it, or a slow-motion quality to the images. He replayed it the way you replay something that will not leave you alone, precisely because it is not dramatic. It is small. 4 seconds. 4 words. A hand raised slightly to signal I have this. A man turning toward a door. That was all. And yet, he replayed it on the drive to work, on the 10 freeway in the morning traffic that moved in the slow, resigned way of Los Angeles traffic, which has accepted its own nature and no longer fights it. He replayed it during the quiet midday hours, when the store had no customers and Marcus was at his bench, and the Italian carpet absorbed all sound, and the cases lit their contents in the clean, impartial way they always did, regardless of who was watching. He replayed it at night in his apartment, with a glass of water on the table beside him, and the television on but not watched. He was not, he understood, a cruel person. This was the thing he kept returning to. He was not cruel. He had never in his professional life deliberately humiliated a customer. He had never spoken with contempt. He had never taken pleasure in the quiet architecture of exclusion that luxury retail sometimes builds around itself like a moat, the way some people in his industry did, wearing the store's prestige like a personal achievement, treating every person who could not afford what was behind the glass as a kind of trespasser. He had not done any of that. He had simply looked at a man for 4 seconds and made a complete determination about what that man was and was not, and then acted on that determination with the smooth, practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that, in luxury retail, time was currency and reading a room was a professional skill. The problem, the specific, unresolvable problem that sat with him through the replays, was that his reading had been wrong. Not just wrong about who the man was. That part was recoverable. Famous people walked into stores unrecognized every day. It happened. It was not ideal, but it was human. And most famous people, he suspected, understood this at some level because fame was a condition imposed from the outside and did not change what a person looked like to themselves when they were simply walking through a Tuesday afternoon trying to find a gift. The deeper wrongness was different. He had not seen a person. He had seen clothing. hair, the absence of certain signals, the presence of certain others. He had processed these inputs and produced an output. This person does not belong here, and he had done it so quickly and with such practiced certainty that the process had not felt like a judgment at all. It had felt like reading, like simply seeing what was there. But what was there was a person, a specific, irreducible, particular human being who had walked in from the ordinary afternoon, with knowledge and intention and a card in his wallet and, as it turned out, a history with a family that made the whole transaction something more than a transaction. Preston had not seen any of that. He had seen 4 seconds. He started paying different attention. This was not a dramatic resolution. He did not go home and read books about unconscious bias, though later he would. He did not sign up for a workshop, or write a personal mission statement, or begin a journal. He was too honest with himself for the kind of self-improvement that is primarily about feeling improved, rather than actually changing. He just started noticing. He noticed in the store, where he began to observe the difference between the way he greeted customers who arrived with the visible markers of wealth and the way he greeted those without them, and found the difference larger and more automatic than he had wanted to believe. He noticed on the street, where he caught himself reading people in the same 4-second way, the clothes, the bearing, the signals, and saw the conclusion assembling itself before he had time to question it. He noticed in meetings, in restaurants, in the dry cleaner on Doheny where a man in paint-stained overalls was picking up what turned out to be an immaculate dinner jacket, and Preston had to stop and observe what his brain had done with the paint stains before the jacket was visible, and he did not particularly like what he observed. He did not become a saint. He was clear-eyed about this. The 4-second process did not simply stop because he had identified it. It was too old and too practiced for that. But the window between the automatic assessment and the action taken on it, that window began to widen, a half-second, then a second. Then, occasionally, enough space to ask the question he had not asked on that Tuesday afternoon. What do I actually know about this person? Almost always, the honest answer was, nothing yet. On the Friday after the Tuesday, 5 days later, he called Lena into the small office at the back of the store. She came in with the careful composure of someone who was not certain whether this was good news or a consequence, which told him something about what working for him had felt like from her side. And that observation settled in him uncomfortably and stayed. He told her about the email. He told her about the commission. He told her that effective immediately, her title was Senior Sales Associate, 2 years ahead of the standard timeline at Feldman and Holt, and that her salary would be adjusted to reflect that title beginning at the start of the next pay period. Lena listened to all of this, with her hands folded in her lap, and her face in the careful, neutral expression of someone receiving information they are not fully sure is real yet, and are therefore not allowing themselves to feel before it is confirmed. When he finished, she said, "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell." He said, "Preston." She looked at him. It was the first time he had told anyone in the store to use his first name. He said, "I owe you an apology. Not for the commission. The commission is yours by every measure, and I should have seen that before Tuesday. I owe you an apology because you have been in this store for 3 months, and I have not paid the kind of attention to you that I paid to the inventory. That is an error of professional judgment, and I intend to correct it." Lena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father always said that a watch that runs wrong isn't a bad watch. It just needs the right person to look inside it." Preston looked at her. He said, "He sounds like someone worth knowing." Lena said, "He was the best person I ever knew." Preston nodded. He did not say anything else, because there was nothing to add to that. She stood to leave. She was at the office door when he said, "One more thing." She turned. He said, "I sent you an email on Tuesday night. There's a 3rd paragraph." She said, "I read it." He said, "I meant it." She said, "I know." She paused at the door. "That's why I came in on Wednesday." She left. He sat in the office for a while after, in the particular quiet that follows a conversation in which something real has been exchanged rather than simply communicated. And he thought about the 4 seconds, and the 4 words, and the man who had said, with no anger, with no performance of wisdom, that the most valuable things almost never look the way you expect. He thought about Lena Park, who had been in his store for 3 months, and whom he had never truly looked at, until the moment she said a name across a room and changed everything. He thought about a watchmaker named Carlos Reyes, whom he had never met and would never meet, and who had apparently been looking at people correctly for 22 years from a bench on Sunset Boulevard. He picked up his pen. He pulled a notepad toward him. At the top of a fresh page he wrote one question, not an answer, just a question, because he had enough honesty left to know that the answers would take longer. He wrote, "What else have I not seen?" He looked at it for a long moment. Then he put the pen down and went back out onto the floor, into the clean light and the Italian carpet and the bulletproof cases, and he began, slowly, imperfectly, one customer at a time, to try to see better. Marco Reyes woke up most mornings before the sun. Not because he set an alarm. He did not own an alarm clock and had not owned one since he was 19, when he decided that anything worth doing was worth waking up for naturally, and anything that required an alarm to get him there probably needed to be reconsidered. He woke early because the garage was coldest in the first hour before dawn, and cold was when the metal was most honest. When a frame was cold, it showed you exactly where the stress had been. You could run your hands along a cold engine casing and feel things that warmth would hide, the same way you could sometimes see a person most clearly before they had put the day's presentation on. Carlos had taught him that. Not about garages. Carlos's world was the watch bench, the loop, the regulation of tiny springs, but about paying attention before the world warmed up and started performing itself. About the value of the first, unguarded look at a thing. The garage was on Cesar Chavez Avenue in East Los Angeles, a neighborhood that had been changing for years in the specific way that neighborhoods change when money begins to notice them. Slowly at first, and then with a speed that left the people who had always lived there feeling like guests in their own story. The building itself was concrete block, painted over so many times that the surface had the layered, complicated texture of something that had been many things before it became this. The landlord was a man named Hector Bautista, who lived in Monterey Park, and who had raised the rent twice in 3 years, and who Marco suspected would raise it a 3rd time before the year was out. Marco paid it because the space was right. High ceilings, essential for lifting frames. A concrete floor with good drainage. A single north-facing skylight that threw clean, directionless light across the workbench for most of the morning. The kind of light that did not create shadows in the wrong places and did not make chrome look like something it was not. And the door. The large, rolling door that opened the full front of the garage to the street, which Marco kept open when he worked, because he believed that work done in the open was better work, more honest, more connected to the world it would eventually go back out into. People walked by and looked in. Sometimes they stopped. Sometimes they asked questions. Marco answered everything. He had learned this from his father, who said that the best advertisement for craftsmanship was simply letting people watch. His current project was a 1968 Triumph Bonneville T120. He had found it 8 months ago in a storage facility in Burbank, under a tarpaulin that had not been moved in what the storage facility manager estimated was 15 years. The frame had surface rust but was structurally clean. The engine, a 649cc parallel twin that had powered some of the finest motorcycles the British industry had ever produced, was seized, which was exactly what you would expect from 15 years of immobility, and which was exactly the kind of problem Marco loved most, because a seized engine was not a broken engine. It was an engine that had stopped trusting movement, and needed to be persuaded back. He had spent 4 months on the engine alone. He had sourced parts from 2 suppliers in England and 1 in New Zealand. He had found a gasket set that was no longer manufactured and had a machinist in Glendale fabricate replacements from the original specifications. He had cleaned and polished and measured and adjusted with the focused, unhurried care of a man who understood that this machine was 60 years old and deserved to be treated not as a project, but as a conversation. By March of 2023, the Bonneville ran. Not perfectly yet. There was a slight hesitation in the low-throttle response that Marco was working through. A carburetor balance issue that was small enough that most people would not notice it, and large enough that Marco could not leave it alone. But it ran. When he first kicked it over, and the engine turned and caught and settled into its distinctive parallel twin idle, a sound that was less like a machine and more like a large, patient animal breathing, Marco had stood back and put his hands in his pockets and looked at it for a long time without speaking. He had a customer waiting for the Bonneville, a man from Silver Lake who had found Marco through a friend who had found Marco through another friend, which was how all of Marco's customers found him. The chain of word of mouth that was the only kind of advertising available to a shop that was not legally a shop. The Silver Lake man had agreed to a price of $14,000 for the restoration, which barely covered Marco's parts costs and nothing like his labor, but which Marco had accepted because he wanted the Bonneville to go to someone who understood what it was. And the Silver Lake man had come to the garage on a Sunday afternoon and sat on the concrete floor and asked questions for 2 hours, which was Marco's primary metric for whether a person deserved a particular motorcycle. He was finishing the carburetor balance on the morning of the Saturday in April when he heard the motorcycle. He heard it before he saw it because the sound of it was distinctive, not a Japanese 4-cylinder, not an American V-twin, but something with the particular exhaust note of an Arch motorcycle, which was a sound Marco knew because he had studied Arch the way engineers study things they admire and cannot yet afford, which is to say thoroughly and with close attention to the details that other people missed. He was underneath the Bonneville on a rolling board when the sound stopped outside the garage door. He heard boots on concrete. He stayed where he was for a moment, finishing the adjustment he was in the middle of, because a task deserved completion, regardless of what was happening above it. Then he slid out from under the frame on the rolling board and looked up from the floor at the figure standing in the open doorway, with a helmet under one arm, backlit by the April morning. The man was tall. He was wearing a jacket with the Arch motorcycle logo on the left chest, not a branded jacket purchased for appearance, but a worn working jacket of the kind that people wore because they were part of the thing the logo represented, rather than because they wanted to look like they were. His hair was dark and long, and he had not shaved in some time. Marco lay on the concrete and looked up at him. He did not say anything immediately. This was partly because he was still processing what his eyes were sending him, and partly because Marco Reyes was constitutionally disinclined to speak before he had something worth saying. The man looked around the garage slowly. He looked at the tools arranged on the wall in their specific, ordered positions. He looked at the workbench with its cloth surface and its careful organization. He looked at the parts tray on the left side with its labeled compartments and its meticulous cleanliness. He looked at the Bonneville, still raised on the lift, its engine exposed and its chrome catching the morning light from the skylight above. He looked at it the way people looked at it when they understood what it was. Then he looked back down at Marco on the floor. He said, "That's a T120. Marco said, 1968. The man said, "Original frame?" Marco said, "Original everything except the gaskets. Had them fabricated." The man nodded slowly. He said, "Your father used to keep my seconds straight." Marco went very still on the concrete floor. The morning light from the skylight lay across the Bonneville's tank in a clean, flat line. The neighborhood was doing its Saturday morning things outside. A dog somewhere, a radio, the particular unhurried texture of an East Los Angeles weekend. Inside the garage it was quiet, in the specific way it was always quiet, when something important was being said. Marco sat up from the rolling board. He did not stand yet. He sat on the concrete with his back against the lift column, and looked at the man in the doorway. He said, "You're Keanu Reeves." The man said, "Yes." Marco said, "My father talked about you." Keanu said, "He talked about you too." This was a sentence Marco was not prepared for. He had known, from what Lena had told him 4 days ago, that Keanu had listened to the family's story in a watch store on Rodeo Drive. He had known about Rosa, and the note card, and the call to Diane. He had known, in the general shape of the thing, that something extraordinary had moved through his family in the past 2 weeks. He had not known that his father had talked about him, that Carlos, sitting at a bench on Sunset Boulevard with a man he had met once and would not see again, had spoken about his son, had carried Marco into that conversation the way parents carry their children everywhere, even into rooms the children will never enter, even across distances the children will never cross. Marco looked at the concrete floor for a moment. Then he stood up. He was the same height as Keanu, and he had Carlos's hands, wide across the palm, the fingers slightly blunt at the tips, in the way of people who worked with their hands at a level where precision and strength were both required. He wiped his right hand on his work pants and extended it. Keanu took it. The handshake was the handshake of 2 people who worked with machines. Firm, brief, the grip of mutual respect rather than social performance. Marco said, "You want to see the engine?" Keanu said, "Very much." They spent 2 hours in the garage. What happened in those 2 hours was the kind of conversation that happens between 2 people who share a language that is not made of words. The language of mechanisms, of tolerances, of the specific relationship between a craftsman and the object of their craft. Keanu asked questions about the carburetor balance with the genuine technical curiosity of someone who had spent years building motorcycles rather than simply riding them. Marco answered with the same directness he brought to everything, not performing knowledge, but simply deploying it in the company of someone who could receive it at full strength. They talked about the Bonneville. They talked about parallel twin dynamics, and the specific challenges of carbureting a 1968 engine with modern fuel. They talked about Arch. Keanu spoke about it with the particular passion of someone describing work that was personally meaningful rather than professionally strategic. And Marco listened with the close attention of someone who had studied that work from the outside and was now hearing it described from the inside. At some point, Marco could not have said exactly when, because the morning had lost its formal time structure in the way that good conversations did. Keanu mentioned the business license. He did not make a production of it. He said it the way he said everything, directly, without theater, as a practical matter between 2 people who were both clear-eyed about practical matters. He said he knew someone at the city business licensing office who handled small commercial operations. He said that the paperwork for a sole proprietorship automotive restoration business was not complicated, but was frequently navigated badly by people doing it for the first time, which led to delays and rejections that had nothing to do with the quality of the business, and everything to do with the specific formatting requirements of the forms. He said he could have someone walk Marco through it, if Marco wanted. Marco looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Why?" Keanu said, "Because your father spent 22 years making sure other people's most important things kept working. Somebody ought to return the favor to his family." Marco was quiet. He looked at the Bonneville on the lift. He looked at the skylight above it. He looked at the tools on the wall and the sign he had sketched on graph paper and taped above the workbench. The sign with the name of the shop he had been planning for 8 years, in the handwriting that looked more like Carlos's than he realized. He said, "The sign says Reyes Restoration." Keanu looked at it. He nodded once. He said, "Good name." They stayed in the garage until noon. When Keanu left, He rode the arch back out onto Cesar Chavez Avenue and into the East Los Angeles Saturday, and Marco stood in the open doorway and watched him go. Then he went back inside. He picked up his tools. He went back to the carburetor balance on the Bonneville, the small hesitation in the low throttle response, the thing that most people would not notice and that he could not leave alone. He worked through the afternoon. At 4 o'clock, the hesitation was gone. The Bonneville ran perfectly. The shoebox had been under the bed for 4 years. Dorothy knew exactly where it was. She had known every day for 4 years, had been aware of it with the specific, peripheral consciousness that you maintain around things that are too important to approach and too important to lose. It was a brown shoebox, the kind that came with a pair of men's dress shoes, and Carlos had written his name on the lid in black marker in the small, precise handwriting that was identical to the handwriting in his journal and on his workbench labels. And in the birthday cards he wrote to the children every year without fail, always on time, always with a sentence inside that was specifically about that child and no other. She had opened it once. The night he died, September 14, 2019, when she came home from the hospital at 4 a.m., and the apartment was full of the children who had gathered and then fallen asleep in their grief. Lena on the sofa, Marco on the floor with a pillow from the hall closet, Rosa in Dorothy's own bed because she was the youngest, and Dorothy could not bear for her to be alone in a room that night. Dorothy had walked through the apartment quietly, looking at her sleeping children, and then she had gone to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the shoebox from underneath it and opened it. She had seen the journal on top. She had seen the envelopes beneath it, the small collection of cards and letters and folded papers that Carlos had kept for reasons she did not yet understand. She had seen, at the very bottom, a small cardboard watchbox with a faded label she could not read in the dark. She had closed the lid. She had put the box back. She had lain down on the bed beside the sleeping Rosa and stared at the ceiling until the morning came. She had not opened it again. 4 years. Not because she was afraid of it. Dorothy Reyes was not afraid of many things, and was honest enough with herself to know the difference between fear and grief, which was that fear kept you from moving towards something, and grief kept you from moving away from it. What kept her from the shoebox was not fear. It was the specific tenderness of knowing that whatever was inside, it was the last room of her husband she had not yet entered, and that once she entered it, there would be no more rooms. She wanted to save it. She had been saving it for 4 years, and on a Thursday night in April 2023, 2 days after Marco had called her from the garage and told her, in the careful, deliberate way Marco said important things, that Keanu Reeves had spent 2 hours in the garage and talked about the business license and looked at the Bonneville and said that Carlos had spoken about Marco on Sunset Boulevard in 2017. Dorothy sat at the kitchen table alone after midnight and understood that she was ready. Not because the grief was over. Grief did not end in the way that people who had not experienced it sometimes believed it did. It changed. It shifted its weight and redistributed itself across the years and became something you carried differently rather than something you put down. But she was ready. The readiness had something to do with the past 3 weeks. With Lena and the store and Rosa and the note card and Marco and the garage, and the particular way that Carlos kept appearing in the story, the way he kept being present in it, even from the permanent distance of his absence. She felt, sitting at the kitchen table after midnight, that Carlos was trying to tell her something. She went to the bedroom. She pulled the shoebox from under the bed. She carried it to the kitchen table and set it under the light and sat down in front of it, the way she used to sit in front of difficult paperwork, squarely, with her hands flat on the table on either side of it, giving it the full acknowledgement of her presence before she began. She opened the lid. The journal was on top, dark green cover, the spine slightly cracked from use, the pages thick with the specific density of paper that has been written on carefully, rather than quickly. She lifted it out and set it beside the box. She would come back to it. Beneath the journal were the cards and letters. She sorted through them carefully. A birthday card from Lena that Rosa had helped draw flowers on. Rosa was 7, the flowers were technically triangles. A letter from Carlos's mother in Oaxaca, dated 1998, the year he and Dorothy married. A small printed certificate from a watchmaking association recognizing Carlos for a technical paper he had submitted in 2008 on the restoration of vintage Mexican pocket watches, which he had shown her once, and then filed away with the particular modesty of someone who was proud of the work and not the recognition. An envelope with no name on it. She opened it. Inside was a handwritten card. The handwriting was not Carlos's. It was different, larger, slightly uneven, the writing of someone who did not write by hand as regularly as Carlos did, but who had chosen to write by hand for this specific purpose, because it mattered. She read it. The card said, "Mr. Reyes, I wanted to thank you for the 2 hours you gave me on September 3rd. I've had my Submariner worked on by a dozen people over the years. No one has ever explained it to me the way you did. No one has ever treated it, or me, with that kind of care. I hope Rosa becomes the engineer she's going to be. She's lucky to have someone like you in her corner." K.R. Dorothy read it twice. Then she read it a third time, slowly. She turned it over. The back was blank. She turned it face up again and held it under the kitchen light and looked at the 2 initials at the bottom, K.R., which she had seen 4 years ago when this card arrived in the mail, 3 weeks after Carlos died, forwarded from the workshop on Sunset Boulevard, where the mail still went for a while after, because no one had thought to change the address, and which she had read and placed in the shoebox because she did not know who K.R. was, and Carlos was not there to tell her, and she did not have the capacity, in the first weeks of her grief, to investigate. She knew now. She set the card down on the table beside the journal. She reached into the shoebox and found the cardboard watchbox at the bottom. It was small, the kind of box that held a single pocket watch, and the label on it was faded, but readable, in the kitchen light. It read, in Carlos's handwriting, "For Rosa. When she is ready." Dorothy opened the box. Inside, on a small square of watchmaker's cloth, was a pocket watch. Silver case, round, the size of a large coin. She turned it over. The case back was engraved. Not elaborately, not with the ornate decoration of a formal presentation piece, but simply, in the clean lines of a man who had engraved it himself, on his own bench, with his own tools. It said, "Rosa Reyes. The mechanism matters more than the case, Papa." Dorothy put the box down. She put both hands flat on the table. She looked at the pocket watch on its cloth. She looked at the card with the 2 initials. She looked at the journal with its dark green cover and its cracked spine and its 214 entries, each one a watch, each one a person, each one a small, careful record of a life that had moved through the world paying attention. She was quiet for a long time. The apartment was still around her. The freeway kept its distant sound. The kitchen clock, a simple one, a battery-operated one that Carlos had always meant to replace with something better, and never had, because he spent all his attention on other people's timepieces and left his own to the practical and affordable. The kitchen clock moved through its ordinary seconds. Dorothy reached out and picked up the journal. She opened it to the first entry. 2011. A Rolex Datejust, 1972. Crystal replacement and service. The customer note read, "Elderly man. Brought it in wrapped in a handkerchief. Said it belonged to his father. Treated it like a letter he was afraid to open." She read every entry from 2011. She read the 2012 entries and the 2013 entries, and the entries from 2014 and 2015 and 2016 and the long year of 2017, with its particular density of work. The year Carlos had taken on extra clients because Rosa was entering high school, and high school cost more than middle school, and Carlos responded to financial pressure the way he responded to everything, which was to work more carefully rather than more quickly, because he believed that the quality of the work was the only thing he could guarantee, and he would not compromise it. She found the entry from September 3, 2017. It read exactly as Lena had described it. The Submariner, the 2 hours, the name, K. Reeves, the note about Rosa, and the final sentence, "Good man, the kind that doesn't need to be seen to do good." Dorothy touched the sentence with her fingertip. She turned the page. The entries continued. 2017, 2018, into 2019, the handwriting unchanged, the same small precision, the same human notes about the customers, the same careful record of work done well and people met briefly and treated with full attention. The final entry was September 3, 2019. She already knew this. Lena had told her. But reading it was different from being told it. Reading it in Carlos's own handwriting, in the journal he had kept for 8 years, in the specific and irreplaceable evidence of his living hand on the page, this was different. She read it all the way through. She read the part about the Submariner, the part about the 2 hours, the part about Rosa, who Carlos mentioned by name, with pride that did not perform itself. The final sentence, "Good man, the kind that doesn't need to be seen to do good." She closed the journal. She sat at the kitchen table in the after-midnight quiet of the Pasadena apartment, with the journal closed under her hands and the pocket watch on its cloth in front of her, and the handwritten card with 2 initials beside it. And she thought about a man who had spent 22 years looking at the inside of things, who had understood, in the particular way of people who work with mechanisms, that what matters is never the surface, that a case can be gold or steel or plastic, and the movement inside it is either right or it is not, and the case has nothing to do with that. She thought about a man who had written for Rosa. When she is ready on a watchbox and placed it in a shoebox under the bed, 4 years before Rosa would be ready, and 3 years before anyone could have known that a man in ripped jeans would walk into a watch store on Rodeo Drive and sit on a bench and listen and change everything. She thought about how Carlos had known. Not the specifics. He could not have known the specifics. But he had known that Rosa would be ready someday, and that the watch should wait for her, and that the thing engraved on the back of it, "The mechanism matters more than the case," was the thing he most needed her to carry forward into whatever she was going to build. Dorothy reached under the collar of her scrubs and touched the small cross that hung there. She sat with all of it for a long time. The journal, the card, the pocket watch on its cloth, the kitchen clock making its ordinary seconds, the freeway in the distance. Then she reached into the shoebox and found, in the very corner, under the letter from Oaxaca, and beneath a folded receipt she had not yet looked at, one more thing. A textbook. She lifted it out carefully. It was a university-level textbook on mechanical engineering fundamentals, the cover slightly worn at the corners, the spine uncracked, never read, never opened, preserved. She turned it to the front page. There was no inscription, but tucked inside the front cover, between the end paper and the first page, was a receipt. She unfolded it. It was from a bookstore on Sunset Boulevard. It was dated September 3, 2019, 11 days before Carlos died. The receipt was not in Carlos's name. It was purchased on a card belonging to K. Reeves. Dorothy held the receipt under the kitchen light and looked at it for a long time. He had bought Rosa a textbook on his way out of the repair shop. He had left it at the front desk with no card, no name, no explanation. It had arrived at the apartment in a box of Carlos's things from the workshop, unlabeled, and Dorothy had assumed it was something Carlos had ordered and placed it in the shoebox because she did not know where else to put something whose purpose she did not yet understand. She understood now. She understood all of it now. She sat at the kitchen table until the sky outside the kitchen window began its slow change from black to the dark blue that came just before dawn. She did not sleep. She was not tired in the way that required sleep. She was tired in the way that requires sitting still and receiving what has been given to you. At 5:23 a.m., she stood up. She carried the pocket watch carefully to Rosa's room. She opened the door quietly. Rosa was asleep on her back, one arm across the engineering textbook she had fallen asleep reading, her mechanical pencil still in her hand. Dorothy set the watch box on the desk beside the notebook with the 11 pages of preparation for Tuesday's call. She looked at her daughter sleeping with a pencil in her hand. She thought, Carlos, look at her. She closed the door quietly and went to make coffee and wait for the morning to finish arriving. The numbers matter. The title promised millions, and this story keeps its promises. But numbers, like watch cases, are only the outside of something. What they contain is always more interesting than what they display. So here are the numbers, and here is what lived inside them. On the afternoon of March 14, 2023, Preston Caldwell made a 4-second decision that cost Feldman and Holt timepieces on Rodeo Drive a total of $4.2 million. Not the $380,000 that processed through the register that Tuesday. That amount was paid, the watches were purchased, the commission was earned. The $4.2 million was a different kind of cost. It was the cost of what did not happen because of what did. Here is how the accounting worked. Keanu Reeves had not arrived on Rodeo Drive alone in purpose that Tuesday afternoon. He had arrived as the informal center of a coordinated acquisition plan that involved 2 other serious collectors. Men he had been speaking with for several months about building complementary watch collections that would appreciate together over time. The kind of considered, long-term strategy that serious collectors used and that watch boutiques competed fiercely to be part of, because the commissions on a coordinated acquisition of that scale were transformative, rather than merely significant. The 2 collectors were men of considerable means and considerable knowledge. The first was a technology founder from San Francisco named Daniel Osei, who had been collecting haute horlogerie for 11 years, and whose personal collection, according to people who had seen it, contained pieces that belonged in a museum and occasionally were loaned to one. The second was a retired architect from Malibu named Richard Strand, whose specific interest was in independent watchmakers, Journe, Dufour, Voutilainen, de Bethune, the makers who existed outside the large conglomerate structures and produced work of such individual character that each piece was effectively a singular object rather than a product. Both men had been planning to visit Feldman and Holt on Keanu's recommendation. Not that week, necessarily. These things moved at their own pace. But in the coming months, as part of a series of visits to boutiques across Los Angeles and New York that Keanu had been informally organizing with the unhurried patience of someone who understood that the best acquisitions were never rushed. After the Tuesday afternoon, they did not come. Not because Keanu told them not to. He did not make a production of what had happened. He did not post about it, did not call the store out publicly, did not speak to the press. He was not that kind of person, as anyone who had spent more than 20 minutes reading anything written about him already understood. He simply did not, in the weeks that followed, continue to recommend Feldman and Holt with the same enthusiasm he had brought to it before. When Daniel Osei asked him in early April how the Beverly Hills boutique had been, Keanu said, honestly and without elaboration, "The merchandise is excellent." The experience was uneven. Daniel Osei, who had spent 11 years developing a fine-grained sensitivity to the quality of the experience in luxury retail, and who understood exactly what uneven meant in that context, took his business elsewhere. He visited a competing boutique 3 blocks south on Rodeo Drive, a smaller operation called Marchetti Timepieces that had been quietly building its reputation for a decade under a soft-spoken owner named Claudia Marchetti, who had trained in Geneva and who ran her floor with the specific philosophy that every person who walked through the door was treated as though they were exactly who they turned out to be, regardless of what they looked like when they arrived. Daniel Osei's purchases at Marchetti Timepieces in 2023 totaled $1.6 million. Richard Strand, following his own separate conversation with Keanu, visited a boutique in West Hollywood that specialized in independent watchmakers. He spent $2.2 million there across 4 visits between April and November of 2023. Combined, $3.8 million that did not go to Feldman and Holt. Add the $380,000 that was purchased on the Tuesday, but that came with an additional $11,600 drawn from the discretionary budget for Lena's commission adjustment. And the total cost of Preston Caldwell's 4-second decision was $4.196 million, which rounded to the $4.2 million that would appear, eventually, in a business case study published by a luxury retail consultancy in early 2025 under the deliberately anonymous title The 4-Second Mistake, Unconscious Bias, and Its Measurable Cost in High-End Retail Environments. Preston Caldwell read the case study when it was published. He recognized himself in it immediately, though his name did not appear and the store was identified only as a Rodeo Drive watch boutique. He read it twice, sitting at his desk in the back office of Feldman and Holt, and then he forwarded it to the store owner in New York with a single line, "This is us. I think we should talk about training." The store owner called him within the hour. That conversation led to a series of staff development sessions that Feldman and Holt implemented across their 2 locations, Beverly Hills and a smaller New York outpost on Madison Avenue. Beginning in September 2023, Preston developed the framework for the sessions himself, drawing on the case study and on his own experience with something he had come to call the 4-second window, and which he described to the staff not as a moral failing, but as a professional reflex that could be identified, interrupted, and replaced with a better one. He brought Lena Park into the development of the training material. She contributed a section that she titled, in the working document, What the Hands Tell You. It was the most read section of the entire framework. These are the numbers from the other side of the ledger. Lena Park's commission on the Tuesday sale was $23,000, the largest single commission paid to a sales associate in the history of Feldman and Holt. Her promotion to senior sales associate came 5 days later. By the end of 2023, she had completed 9 sales above $50,000 and 1 above $200,000, a pace that made her the highest performing associate on the Beverly Hills floor in the store's history. In January 2024, Preston recommended her for assistant manager. The store owner approved the recommendation in under 24 hours. Rosa Reyes enrolled at UCLA's Samueli School of Engineering in September 2023. The call with Professor James Nakamura on the Tuesday after Keanu's visit to the garage lasted not 30 minutes, but 1 hour and 47 minutes. Because Professor Nakamura had opened by asking Rosa to describe her interest in aerospace propulsion systems, and she had answered with such specific, prepared, and genuinely original thinking that he had kept asking questions, and she had kept answering them, and neither of them had looked at the time until Rosa's phone battery dropped to 11%, and she apologized, and Professor Nakamura said, in the tone of a man who had been teaching for 23 years and knew what he was hearing, "Don't apologize." This was the best conversation I've had about composite propulsion in 6 months. He connected her with the Samueli School's Engineering Merit Scholarship Committee. She applied. Her application included her 11 pages of preparation notes, reformatted into a research interest statement, and a personal essay about a watchmaker who had taught her that a mechanism did not know what it cost, only whether it had been understood. She received a scholarship worth $34,000. It was funded, in part, through the educational grant program connected to the Mattel Children's Hospital Gala at UCLA, the same gala that Keanu had attended the Saturday after the Tuesday on Rodeo Drive, where the FP Journe Chronometre Bleu he had purchased for $312,000 was auctioned for $890,000. nearly 3 times its retail price. Because a room full of people who understood watches understood exactly what they were bidding on. Rosa did not know, when she received the scholarship notification, that there was any connection between the gala and the educational grant program. She learned it later, from Lena, who had learned it from a conversation with Diane, Keanu's assistant, who had mentioned it in passing, without making anything of it, because the people who worked for Keanu Reeves had learned, over time, to treat his acts of quiet generosity the way he treated them himself, as ordinary, as simply what you did, as requiring no particular acknowledgement. Marco Reyes filed the paperwork for Reyes Restoration in May 2023, guided through the process by a city licensing specialist who charged nothing for her time, because she had been asked, by a mutual acquaintance, to assist a talented craftsman who needed the bureaucratic part handled correctly so that the actual work could begin. Reyes Restoration opened officially on July 8, 2023, with a ribbon made from a strip of red shop cloth that Marco had cut himself and which Rosa tied in a bow because she had always been the one in the family with steady hands for small things. Dorothy brought a pan of tamales. Lena brought flowers. The Silver Lake man brought his 1968 Triumph Bonneville T120, fully restored, running perfectly, and rode it slowly past the open garage door 3 times, while Marco watched with his hands in his pockets, in the way of a man receiving something he had worked for so long and so quietly that the actual arrival of it required a moment of simple, private acknowledgement before anything else. By December 2023, the shop had a 4-month waiting list. Dorothy Reyes retired from the night shift at Huntington Hospital on December 19, 2023. Her last shift ended at 7 a.m. The day staff arrived, and the ward transitioned into its morning configuration, and Dorothy mopped the last section of corridor she was responsible for. The stretch nearest the supply closet, the one she had mopped 10,000 times. The one where the floor had a particular scuff mark near the doorway that no amount of mopping ever fully removed, and which she had stopped trying to remove years ago and simply worked around, the way you worked around the things that were permanent. She returned the mop to the supply closet. She closed the door. She went to her locker and opened it, and took out her coat and her bag, and the pocket watch that she had begun carrying with her after the night she found it in the shoebox, not yet given to Rosa, because Rosa was not yet ready to receive it, and Dorothy knew the difference between a thing that should be given immediately and a thing that should be given at the right moment, which was a knowledge that came from years of paying attention. She closed the locker. She walked down the corridor for the last time, past the supply closet, past the amber night mode lights that were now switched to full daylight, past the rooms where people were healing, or beginning to, or learning that they would not, the full and impossible range of what a hospital contained at any given moment. She walked out through the main entrance into the December morning. It was cool and clear, the particular clarity of a Southern California winter morning when the air has been cleaned by the night and the light comes in at a low angle that makes everything look briefly precise and new. She stood on the front steps for a moment. She was 59 years old. Her knees ached in the right one worse than the left. She had worked the night shift for 11 years, and the shift before that for 7, and before that, she had worked 2 jobs simultaneously for 4 years when the children were small, and Carlos was building his reputation, and money was the thing they thought about last thing at night and first thing in the morning. She stood on the hospital steps in the December morning, and she breathed. She was not thinking about the $4.2 million, or the scholarship, or the watch boutique, or any of the extraordinary machinery of the past 9 months that had moved through her family's life, and rearranged it into something she was still learning to recognize. She was thinking about Carlos. She was thinking about a man who had spent 22 years looking at the inside of things, and who had known, in the patient and unhurried way he knew everything, that mechanisms ran best when they were understood, rather than simply used, and that people were the same. And that the work of seeing someone clearly was never wasted, even when it seemed to disappear into the ordinary air of an ordinary afternoon on Sunset Boulevard, with nothing to show for it but 2 hours and a conversation, and a name written in red ink on the final page of a journal. She reached into her coat pocket and held the pocket watch in her closed hand without taking it out. She felt the shape of it, the weight of it, the specific, present reality of a thing that Carlos had held and engraved and placed in a box with a daughter's name on it, long before anyone knew what the box would mean. She held it in her closed hand, and she stood in the December morning. Then she walked down the steps and turned toward the bus stop and went home to her family. There is something this story has been holding back, not to deceive, not for the cheap satisfaction of a withheld twist that reframes everything that came before it into something lesser, but because some truths have a correct moment of arrival, and the correct moment for this one is here, at the end, when all the pieces are present, and the shape of the whole thing can finally be seen. The clue was always visible. It was in Carlos's journal, in the entry dated September 3, 2017. It was in the textbook receipt tucked inside the front cover of an engineering fundamentals book. It was in the handwritten card with 2 initials that had arrived at a Pasadena apartment in the weeks after a watchmaker's death and been placed in a shoebox by a grieving wife who did not yet know who had sent it. It was in the way Keanu Reeves went very still when Lena said her father's name in a watch store on Rodeo Drive. Not surprised. Still, the stillness of a man who already knew. Here is what this story has been holding. Between 2019 and 2023, between the September morning, when Carlos Reyes sat with Keanu for 2 hours on Sunset Boulevard, and the March afternoon when Lena said his name across a room, Keanu Reeves had not forgotten the Reyes family. He had not filed them away in the general category of pleasant encounters, and moved on. He had done what he apparently did with people who mattered to him, which was to continue paying attention to them, quietly, from a distance, in the specific and unhurried way of someone who understood that care was not an event, but a practice. When Carlos died in September 2019, Keanu found out. He found out because he had stayed in loose contact with the workshop on Sunset Boulevard, Precision & Son, where Carlos had been the senior technician. Not through Carlos directly, because Carlos was not a man who maintained contact with clients beyond the professional, but through the workshop owner. A man named Gerald Sung, who had known Carlos for 15 years and who had, on one occasion in 2018, mentioned to Keanu during a routine service appointment that his senior technician was the finest he had ever employed and that he hoped to keep him for another 20 years. When Gerald Sung called in September 2019 to say that Carlos had died of a heart attack at 61, Keanu had sat with that information for a long time. He sent the card. He wrote it by hand because that was what the moment required, and he was not a man who outsourced moments that required him personally. He addressed it to the workshop, to be forwarded, because he did not have the family's home address and did not feel it was appropriate to seek it. He did not sign his full name because he did not want the card to be about him. It was about Carlos. The textbook he had bought that same afternoon from the bookstore on Sunset, a university-level text on mechanical engineering fundamentals, the kind a serious student would use in a first-year program, he had left at the front desk of the workshop without a note. He had simply said, "Carlos mentioned his daughter wants to study engineering. Keep this for the family." Gerald Sung had packed it with Carlos's things. Dorothy had placed it in the shoebox. It had waited 4 years in the dark under a bed in Pasadena for a morning when its meaning would become clear. This was not the last thing Keanu did. Between 2019 and 2022, through a personal giving foundation that he ran with the same preference for anonymity that characterized everything he did in this register of his life, he made 2 separate donations to a vocational scholarship fund connected to Precision & Son. The fund had been established by Gerald Sung in 2015 to support young craftspeople pursuing training in watchmaking, horology, and related precision trades. It was small, underfunded and underpublicized, the way that programs connected to specialized crafts always were. And the 2 donations Keanu made did not save it, but they sustained it through 2 years when it would otherwise have closed. The fund had paid for Marco's trade certification. Marco had applied for the certification in 2020, at the height of the pandemic, when the garage was closed and the restoration work had stopped, and he had spent the enforced stillness of those months studying, taking apart, and reassembling every engine he owned, reading every technical manual he could access, and finally formalizing the knowledge he had accumulated across years of self-teaching into the certified qualification that would eventually make Reyes restoration a legitimate business rather than an exceptional hobby. He had applied to the Precision & Son Vocational Fund because Gerald Sung had mentioned it to him once, in passing, when Marco had brought a watch of Carlos's in for service the year after the funeral. He had received the full certification grant. He had never known where the money came from. The fund did not disclose individual donors. Gerald Sung did not tell him because he did not know the specific source either. The foundation's donations came through a legal intermediary, and the paperwork listed only the foundation name. Marco found out on a Saturday morning in April 2023 in a garage on Cesar Chavez Avenue, when a man in an arch motorcycle jacket sat down on a stool and said, in the matter-of-fact way he said everything, "Your father used to keep my seconds straight. I figured the least I could do was try to return the favor." He said it, and then he asked about the carburetor balance on the 1968 Triumph Bonneville, and they talked about engines for 2 hours, and Keanu did not mention the foundation, or the certification grant, or the textbook, or the card, or any of the specific architecture of what he had been doing quietly for 4 years. He did not mention it because it was not the point. This is the revelation, not a twist, not a reframing. A revelation of character, which is the only kind that matters. The man in the ripped jeans had not walked into Feldman and Holt on March 14, 2023, as a stranger to the Reyes family. He had been present in their lives, invisibly, and without requirement of acknowledgement, for the 4 years since Carlos died. The textbook under the bed, the certification grant in Marco's folder, the card with 2 initials in the shoebox. The foundation money that kept a vocational fund alive through a pandemic so that a young man in East Los Angeles could formalize what his hands already knew. None of it had been visible. All of it had been real. When Lena said his name across the store, and he turned from the door and went still, he was not going still with surprise. He was going still with the particular quality of emotion that arrives when something you have been doing in private suddenly becomes present in the open. When the invisible work meets the visible world, and you are asked, without warning, to be in the same room with both of them simultaneously. He had known about Rosa. Carlos had told him about Rosa in 2017, with the specific pride of a father who has identified something extraordinary in his child and cannot quite contain it. He had bought the textbook because of that conversation. He had thought about Rosa, on and off, in the years between, wondered whether the gap had been closed, whether she had enrolled, whether the mechanism Carlos had set in motion had continued running after the watchmaker's hands were no longer on it. Walking into the store that Tuesday, he had not known that Lena worked there. He had not known that the 23-year-old sales associate who watched him from the back of the store was Carlos Reyes's daughter, standing in a watch boutique on Rodeo Drive, the way her father had stood at a bench on Sunset Boulevard, paying the kind of attention to people that most people did not think to pay. When she said his name, he understood, in the way that people understand things that arrive as a completion rather than a surprise, that Carlos had been right about something else too, not just about the watch. not just about the 2 hours, about the children. He told me his daughter wanted to be an engineer, Keanu had said on the bench. And Lena had said, "That's Rosa, she's my sister." And something in the room had changed in the way things change when a circuit closes. When the current that has been traveling finds the connection it was always moving toward, and the whole mechanism lights up. The cliffhanger that has been carried through this story is not a secret about money, or a hidden betrayal, or a revelation that changes the moral complexion of what came before. It is simpler than that, and harder. It is the fact that the good that Carlos Reyes did in his life, the 2 hours he gave, the attention he paid, the specific and irreplaceable quality of his presence in the lives of the people who crossed his bench, did not stop when he stopped. It kept moving. It moved through Keanu, who had been changed by those 2 hours, in the specific way that genuine encounters change people, and who had responded to that change not with a grand gesture, but with the patient, continuous, unglamorous practice of returning something to the family of a man who had given him something he could not have bought. The mechanism kept running, even after the watchmaker's hands were gone. Preston Caldwell reads this story later, not this version, but the version that lives inside the business case study published in early 2025, between whose carefully anonymous lines he can read every detail of the Tuesday afternoon as though it were happening in real time. He reads it at his desk in the back office. He reads it slowly. He reads the 4-second decision and its $4.2 million cost, and the training framework that followed, and the life of a young woman who became the best sales associate in the history of the store, and the certification grant, and the textbook, and the card with 2 initials. He reads the sentence Carlos wrote on September 3, 2017. Good man. The kind that doesn't need to be seen to do good. He sits with that sentence for a long time. Then he opens a new document on his computer. At the top he types, "What we owe the people who walk through our door." It is the first line of the training framework introduction he is writing. It will be read by every new hire at Feldman and Holt, beginning in September 2023. It will be the first thing they encounter on their first day, before the product training, before the client protocols, before the pricing guides and the commission structures, and the careful, necessary machinery of the business. Before any of that, they will read this. Because Preston Caldwell has learned, at a cost of $4.2 million and 1 moment of private reckoning in a back office in Beverly Hills, that the most valuable thing in any room is never behind the glass. It is standing in front of it. It walked through the door. It is already here. December 2023 arrived in Los Angeles the way it always did, not with the dramatic seasonal shift that other cities experienced. No first frost, no bare trees, no sky turning the particular iron gray of a winter that meant business. Los Angeles changed seasons the way it changed everything, subtly and without announcement. A few degrees cooler in the mornings, the light arriving at a slightly lower angle that made the shadows longer, and the late afternoons briefly golden, in a way that was different from the summer gold, quieter and more considered, as though the year were finally sitting down after a long time on its feet. The engineering showcase was held on a Thursday evening in the Boelter Hall atrium at UCLA's Samueli School of Engineering. The atrium was a high-ceilinged space that managed to be both institutional and beautiful, the way the best university buildings were, serious without being cold, designed for the kind of work that required both rigor and imagination, and that therefore needed a room which could hold both simultaneously. The showcase ran from 6 to 9. Students from across the engineering disciplines presented first-semester research projects, posters, models, demonstrations, the careful and earnest preliminary work of people who were at the beginning of something large and who knew it and were not frightened by the knowledge, but energized by it. Rosa Reyes presented at Station 14. Her project was a materials analysis study examining titanium alloy fatigue behavior under simulated aerospace thermal cycling conditions. not a first-semester project by any reasonable measure, but Rosa had not approached her first semester as a beginning. She had approached it as a continuation of something she had already been doing for years, which was studying the relationship between materials and mechanisms with the focused, unhurried intensity of a person who understood that the work had no real starting point, only a series of deeper levels of understanding that revealed themselves in order as you moved through them. Professor James Nakamura had read her project proposal in October and sent her a single-line email that said, "This is a second-year project. Do it anyway." She had. The poster was clean and precise, the data presented in the careful, uncluttered format of someone who understood that clarity was not the enemy of complexity, but its best advocate. Her graphs were hand-annotated in the small, controlled handwriting she used for problem sets. Her conclusions were stated without overreach. Here is what the data shows. Here is what it suggests. Here is what remains to be determined. Here is the next question. Professor Nakamura stood at her station for 11 minutes, which was longer than he stood at any other station in the atrium that evening, and which the other students noticed and filed away as information about what serious work looked like when someone who knew how to recognize it stood in front of it. Dorothy arrived at 6:15 with Marco and Lena. She was wearing a dark green dress that she had bought 2 weeks before the showcase, on a Saturday afternoon trip to a department store in Pasadena, with Lena, who had insisted on coming, and who had stood outside the fitting room and given her assessment of each option, with the specific, loving directness of a daughter who had spent 3 months selling luxury goods and had consequently developed opinions about quality that she was now unable to suppress. Dorothy had chosen the dark green because Carlos had always said she looked like herself in dark green. She was wearing a watch, not the pocket watch. That was Rosa's, and had been given to Rosa on the morning of her first day of classes in September, placed on her desk beside her notebook before she woke, in the watch box with the faded label and the inscription on the caseback, because Dorothy had decided that the first day of the thing Carlos had believed in was the right moment, and she did not second-guess the decision once she had made it. Rosa had found it before Dorothy was awake. She had come to the kitchen in the early morning, still holding the open watch box, wearing the expression of someone who had just received something they understood completely, and needed a moment to exist inside the full weight of it before speaking. She had not spoken. She had simply walked to where Dorothy stood at the counter and put her arms around her mother from behind and held on. Dorothy had put her hand over Rosa's hands. They had stood like that in the kitchen in the early September morning for a long time, the two of them, without words, while the coffee finished brewing and the pale light came through the window and the freeway kept its distant, ordinary sound. The watch Dorothy was wearing at the showcase was different. It was a 1974 Seiko 5, Carlos's first watch, the one he had purchased as a young man learning the trade, the one he had worn on his wrist for 11 years before the work made him too careful about wrist-worn things near delicate mechanisms, and he had placed it in the shoebox for safekeeping. The Seiko 5 was not an expensive watch. It had never been an expensive watch. In 1974, it had cost the equivalent of what a careful young watchmaker could save in 2 months if he was disciplined about it, which Carlos had been, because Carlos was always disciplined about things that mattered. It was a tool watch, a working watch, the watch of a man who wore it not as an accessory or a statement or a signal of anything about himself to the world, but simply because he needed to know the time, and he appreciated the mechanism that told it. Carlos had kept it in perfect working order for 45 years. Dorothy had found it in the shoebox on the night she opened it, beneath the journal and the cards and the watchbox with Rosa's name, in a small velvet bag that Carlos had made himself from a piece of watchmaker's cloth. She had taken it to Marcus, the senior horologist at Feldman and Holt, who had serviced it quietly one afternoon and returned it to her in the same velvet bag, running perfectly, keeping time to within 2 seconds per day, which for a mass-produced mechanical watch from 1974 was a testament not to the watch's design, though the design was good, but to the 50 years of care that had been given to it by hands that understood what care was for. She had put it on her wrist on the morning of December 19th, the morning she retired, and she had worn it every day since. She wore it into the Boelter Hall atrium on the Thursday evening showcase, and it moved through the room on her wrist the way it had moved through every moment of the 3 weeks she had worn it. Quietly, without drawing attention, doing its work. At 7:30, Dorothy stood in front of Station 14. Rosa was explaining her methodology to a cluster of 3 students from another program who had wandered over to look at the poster and had stayed because the explanation was more interesting than they had expected. She was talking about thermal cycling parameters and alloy grain structure with the calm authority of someone who had studied this for months and was now simply reporting what she had learned, without performance, without the self-conscious hesitation that afflicted first-semester students who were not yet sure their knowledge was real enough to be spoken out loud. Her knowledge was real. It had always been real. It had been real at 9 years old, when she reassembled a Seth Thomas pendulum movement in 2 hours and 14 minutes. It had been real at 14, when she decided that someone needed to understand how machines worked if machines were going to go to space. It had been real in the apartment on the Thursday morning, when she filled 11 pages of preparation for a call with a professor she had not yet met, and then studied for 9 more hours, because 11 pages was not enough. It was real now, in the Boelter Hall atrium, in the specific and undeniable way of things that have been built over time from the inside out, from genuine curiosity and genuine discipline, and the particular inheritance of a father who had spent 22 years demonstrating that understanding a mechanism, truly understanding it, was never wasted work. Dorothy watched her daughter explain aerospace material science to 3 strangers who had not planned to stop but could not make themselves leave. She felt the watch on her wrist. She thought about Carlos. She thought about him the way she thought about him now, not with the acute, destabilizing grief of the first years, not with the raw and specific absence that had made the early mornings so difficult, but with the settled, warm, present feeling of someone who has been loved well and knows it and carries that knowledge forward as a form of company. She thought about a man who had looked at the inside of things for 22 years, who had understood that a mechanism ran best when it was understood, who had sat with a quiet man in ripped jeans for 2 hours on a September afternoon in 2017, and spoken about his children with the uncomplicated pride of someone who did not need the future to be certain in order to believe in it, who had written, in red ink on the final page of his journal, a name, who had placed a pocket watch in a box with a daughter's name on it, who had understood, in the patient and unhurried way he understood everything, that the things you did with genuine care did not stop when you stopped, that they kept moving, that they found their way through the people you had touched, through the invisible network of small and careful attentions, through the mechanisms of ordinary human connection that ran on no power source except the willingness to see and be seen, and treat both as something worth the effort. Marco was standing beside Dorothy. He was wearing a clean shirt, which for Marco represented approximately the same degree of formality as a tuxedo for anyone else. And his hands were in his pockets, and he was watching Rosa with the expression of an older brother who has been watching his younger sister be extraordinary since she was old enough to be extraordinary, which in Rosa's case was very young, and who has never fully accustomed himself to the particular quality of pride that came with it. Lena was on Dorothy's other side. She was wearing the same calm, attentive expression she wore on the floor of Feldman and Holt, the expression of someone paying the right kind of attention to something that deserved it. She had a commission meeting in the morning. She had 3 client follow-ups scheduled for the afternoon. She had a mentoring session with a new associate who had started 2 weeks ago and who reminded her, in small and specific ways, of herself at 11 weeks. Careful, observant, slightly too nervous to eat lunch at the staff table. She intended to fix that. Professor James Nakamura found Dorothy at 8 o'clock, near the refreshment table, while Rosa was answering questions from a faculty member in the aerospace department who had seen the poster and come over with her own questions that were not the questions of someone being polite, but of someone genuinely engaged. Nakamura introduced himself. Dorothy shook his hand. He said, "Your daughter is one of the strongest students I've encountered in my first semester cohort in 23 years of teaching." Dorothy said, "Her father would be glad to hear that." Nakamura said, "I understand he was a craftsman." Dorothy said, "He was the best person I ever knew." Nakamura nodded. He looked across the atrium to where Rosa was now drawing a diagram on the back of someone's program with a borrowed pen, explaining something with the focused animation of a person who has found the exact right audience for a thought they have been developing and is experiencing the particular joy of thinking out loud in front of someone who can think back. He said quietly, "Whatever he taught her, it shows." Dorothy looked at her daughter drawing the diagram. She looked at Rosa's hands, the hands that had taken apart a clock at 9 and put it back together in 2 hours and 14 minutes. The hands that had filled 11 pages of preparation in a single day. The hands that now held a borrowed pen and drew on the back of a program in a university atrium, while a professor and a faculty member leaned in to follow the diagram. And the hands that wore, on the right wrist, a small silver pocket watch on a chain that Rosa had found a way to wear because she was a mechanical engineer in training, and had solved the problem of how to wear a pocket watch as a wristwatch with a simple custom-made bracket that she had designed herself and had fabricated at the university machine shop in the second week of the semester, because she wanted it close, and she wanted it visible, and she wanted to feel the weight of it when she worked. The inscription on the back faced her wrist. She could not see it when she wore it, but she knew what it said. Rosa Reyes. The mechanism matters more than the case. "Papa!" Dorothy felt the Seiko 5 on her own wrist. She felt its weight. Its specific, familiar, irreplaceable weight. The weight of a watch that had kept perfect time for 45 years, in the hands of a man who had understood that the work was always worth doing well, even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching, because the work did not exist for the watching. It existed for itself, for the mechanism, for the small, precise, essential truth that a thing which runs correctly, regardless of whether anyone sees it running. Carlos always said that. Time, after all, was the one thing he never wasted. She stood in the Boelter Hall atrium with her son on one side and her eldest daughter on the other, and watched her youngest daughter change the minds of everyone within earshot. And she wore her husband's watch on her wrist, and she was not happy in the simple, uncomplicated way of people who have not been through what she had been through, but something richer and harder to name, something that had grief in it, and pride in it, and love in it, and the specific, sustaining warmth of a woman who knew that the person she had built her life beside had done his work well, had seen people clearly, had kept their seconds straight, had left behind, in journals and watch boxes and 2 hours on a September afternoon and a card with 2 initials, enough to keep the mechanism running long after his hands left it. The atrium was full of light and sound and the particular energy of young people at the beginning of their serious lives. Rosa put the borrowed pen in her pocket and turned and found her family across the room, with the unerring accuracy of someone who always knew where home was, regardless of the distance, and she walked toward them through the crowd. Dorothy held out her arms. Rosa walked into them. And the watch on Dorothy's wrist kept its time, as it always had, as it always would, the small, precise movement inside it, turning its invisible gears in the dark, doing its work, needing no one to watch it to keep it true. And that is the story of what happens when one person decides to truly see another human being. Not the clothes, not the hair, not the 4-second assumption. The person. Carlos Reyes spent 22 years looking at the inside of things. And the world he left behind kept running long after his hands left it. Because kindness does not stop when you stop. It keeps moving. It finds people. It shows up in watch stores and garages and hospital corridors and university atriums and places you never expected it to be. It shows up when someone decides to say a name across a room when it would have been easier to stay quiet. So before you go, we want to ask you something simple. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city, your country, or just say hello in the comments below. We read every single one. And every single one reminds us that people like you, people who sit with a story like this until the very end, are exactly the kind of people this world needs more of. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the way you look at people, if it reminded you of someone like Carlos in your own life, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second. But it tells us that stories like this one matter to you. And when we know that, we make more of them. And if you are new here, welcome. This channel is built for people who believe that the most extraordinary stories are hiding inside ordinary lives. Subscribe so you never miss one. Hit the bell. Bring a friend. Because kindness is the one thing that grows when you share it. Now click on the video appearing on your screen right now. Because that story is waiting for you. And something tells us you are going to want to see how it ends.